Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Nerds Drink Whiskey. These are our Christmas holiday episodes. But let me be clear, if you want to, in the comments, talk about which parts of the holiday season you celebrate, feel free. I know, Krampus Day just passed. We have a couple people on the cast that celebrate Krampus. I have my Krampus shirt on. Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Thanksgiving, Halloween, New Year's. There's a reason why we say Happy Holidays, and that's just because it's basically a time management, and going through the huge list is just ridiculous. So
Krampus came not to reward, but to punish.
Anyways, happy holidays to you. Merry Christmas to those who celebrate that. And this episode is going to be due to occasionally, it's probably about 1% of the people watching and listening, but every once in a while we get somebody who tries to call us on our mantra, which is always sip, never slam. And I think, Jeff, you made a really great
yeah, if you turn that around, it's sip your whiskey, slam your water.
Yeah. Sip your whiskey, slam your water, and we're going to actually demonstrate that. So, Gabe, you are the expert on this. So we're going to have you just to be clear, just for clarity. Let's start it out with Gabe. He's got a shot glass of water because we only slam our water. Gabe, slam that water in 3, 2, 1.
Slam time. Pretty hard right there.
That's a slam. How long did you hold that in your mouth?
Not even half a second.
Not even half a second. That's how you slam. That is not a sip. So a sip can be a tiny sip. Hey, you got the flu. You're going to puke. Tiny sips. That's how you sip. So you're sipping your Gatorade because you're dehydrated. You just do little tiny sips so you don't upset your tummy. Okay, that's a sip. It's a tiny sip. But you can also have a larger sip, and it's still a sip. And it's also about holding it in your mouth and experiencing it. When we review whiskey, there's 3 elements that we try and focus on this show. That is the initial taste when it hits your tongue, the mouth feel when you hold it in your mouth. How does it feel? And then the finish when you swallow. How does it feel going down? Is it a nice warm feeling? It's like, oh, that nice warm feeling of good whiskey, or is it a burn? And if you have to slam the cheap whiskey. Don't slam the good whiskey. So this is a 10-year rye Whistle Pig, and we're going to review it later. But for now, we're all just going to show the proper sip, and it's maybe a large sip, but in our definition, it's still a sip. So in the comments, what we'd like is a ton of comments about what you consider a sip, because for us, when we say always sip, never slam, what we mean is don't do what Gabe just did with his water. Don't slam it. Don't sit there and you don't want it to touch your tongue because it's crap whiskey, so you just have it go down your throat as quick as possible. I don't know. So while I sip my whiskey, why don't you guys describe what you think a sip means and what you think a slam means?
So I always feel it's just an easy, concise way of saying make sure you enjoy and taste your whiskey. The point of it is to experience it, not to just get shit.
You've got to censor television, you fools!
Or I can't say that. Never mind.
You're gonna get bleeped out now.
Yep. Sorry, Mark. You have to edit that. So yeah, if you're treating it as drunk juice, then so you're gonna have to put some blur in there as well. Yeah. So plus, I found you have to take at least enough in there that if you take a too small of a sip, I kind of choke on it. Like, it just goes in the wrong places you need enough liquid in there to actually have your muscles work correctly. If it's too small,
you also don't experience it. You also don't get that mouthfeel. You don't get the real taste of it.
Gabe?
Honestly, I really think that is a very true statement. When it comes down to it, a sip can be the smallest little smidge in your mouth, enough to just kind of let it taste the tip, like let it touch the tip of your tongue and kind of give it that feeling. Or it could be, a healthy pour of almost half the glass if that's what you really want. But you're not slamming your whiskey. You're sitting there taking the time to sit there and enjoy what you're tasting, enjoying the flavors, trying to pick out certain notes, if you will. Instead of actually just letting it go right down your throat and getting rid of it immediately. Slamming it is a waste of time. I agree entirely that you just need to slam your water, sip your whiskey, and enjoy yourself.
Kevin, by the way, for those of you who don't know, this is Kevin Saint.
Hello.
Whoops. This is Kevin Saint.
Oh, there
he is. There's a few episodes ago where he was doing a cooking podcast. What was it called?
The cooking show was.
You might want to eat your mic a little bit closer.
Oh,
Get closer to your mic
up
there.
on it.
Yeah.
The cooking show was called Cooking Ain't Complicated.
Yeah, and so now he's got Fuel Your Fandom, which is just audio, and why don't you first introduce yourself by saying what Fuel Your Fandom is about,
Okay.
and then what do you think when you hear the word sip and when you hear the word slam?
Okay. Well, just real briefly, like Mark said, I run a podcast called Fuel Your Fandom. The idea behind Fuel Your Fandom is that. And I have a tagline too, a saying that I use with my show is everything is fandom and fandom is everything, because fandom is what brings and makes all of us passionate about the things that we're passionate about, whiskey or Star Wars or whatever it is. We're fans of that, and that's our fandom. That's how we get passionate. So I started a podcast. We talk about a range of issues in the fan community. You can find us on facebook.com/Fuel Your Fandom, or you can go to Anchor FM and find us on Anchor FM at Fuel Your Fandom. So,
or you can just go into the show notes here, and there'll be direct links. And
Perfect.
I wanted to point out this is how wide the word fandom is. I don't know if you guys have been watching the Jeff Goldblum series on Disney
haven't
Plus.
got to yet. I've been looking
It
forward
is
to it.
so Jeff Goldblum. I think they basically said, called his agent and said, "Hey, I think we're just going to throw Jeff a bunch of money and just let him do whatever he wants." And it's so bizarrely Jeff Goldblum, but he basically does
That's
these
such
little
high praise.
It's like he will take on subjects that you're like, yeah, I really don't care about that subject. But you watch it, and it's very intriguing because it's Jeff Goldblum. But he took on the subject of tennis shoes. Tennis shoes are something you wear on your feet. They're just not something I'm excited about. But I don't know about how you guys, but I think you're all younger than I am. But when I was growing up, if you would have told me, like, in the future, there will be entire conventions and it'll be a multi-million-dollar industry of collecting and trading and totally, researching tennis shoes, I would have been like, you're ridiculous. Go away, funny man. There's just no way. I could not wrap my head around that idea. But there is. It's this huge sneakerheads. It's a huge fandom of sneakerheads. So anything can be a fandom. I don't care what it is.
And I chose that name strategically because of that.
Yeah,
because while my conversations are all very nerdy, Star Trek, Star Wars, Marvel Comics, things like that, there's things that everybody is passionate about that might necessarily not fall into that category that I can still talk to them about because fandom truly is everything.
And what's funny is the spectrum of fandom is easy.
Yeah. Well, you look. We chose whiskey. We could have done bourbon. I'm more of a bourbon fan myself, but we chose whiskey because it is very wide and it is endless. And we say nerds drink whiskey, and a lot of people think that that's I don't know if misnomer would be the proper term, but the reality is if you want to look at the proper nomenclature of nerds, geeks, whatever. Geeks is your Star Wars, your Marvel, your comic books, things like that, whereas nerd is a fandom. Nerds is you are so passionate about that subject that you're kind of an expert at it, and sometimes more of an expert than the people that went to school for it. So we are passionate fans of whiskey, and so all of our expertise comes from just being part of that fandom. We have never went to school for it. We aren't properly taught, whatever that means. We're not actual distillers. So it's all just because of fandom. So this is our fandom. So it's nerds drink whiskey, not geeks drink whiskey. And by the way, I think it was I can't remember the comic book that said this so clearly, but they debated the term nerd versus the term geek, and then at the end of it they said, and what is the proper nomenclature for those that care about the difference? And well, that would be dweeb. So but anyways, what is for you? To you, what is the difference between a slam and a sip?
I think, just like everyone else said, a sip is kind of whatever you take into your mouth at one given time, slowly. I think, and a lot of, I think the slam, I don't want to call it a culture, the slam thing is heavily romanticized.
You're separating from your mic again.
I know, but if I get right up on it, it's going to look dirty. I'm in a metal band
and
too.
improve our views
a lot. But I think there's a lot of romanticizing of the slam culture. You see things in old Western movies. They belly up to the bar, flip a coin onto the bar, take the shot, and pound it. And that's really, and it's like you said, it's because that's
Censored, censor, bleep, bleep, bleep.
bleep me out. It's because that stuff is.
Stop creating more work for me.
It's because it's rot gut.
Yeah.
It's they don't care what they really. There's no quality control. It's all just whatever someone distilled in their backyard.
One step above moonshine.
Well, right, and maybe barely that.
Make you go blind.
Yeah.
I think the whiskey nerds, we call that drunk juice. Yeah, it's basically it's there just to get drunk. It's not really it's barely you can barely even tag. It's not really honorable to call it whiskey, so we just call it drunk juice.
And I've had some fun with some drunk juice over the years. I tell you, but when it's something worth drinking, it's worth savoring, and that's the difference between a sip and a slam. So I'm gonna sip this now.
Are we talking about this on this episode?
We're not talking about this yet. We're reviewing that next episode. So,
Okay.
But in closing, basically to me, if you're not needing to do chipmunk cheeks, it's a sip. If you have to, hold it in, it takes some effort to not bulge out your cheeks. To me, that's still a sip. If you're having to bulge your cheeks out in any way to hold it, that's not a sip. So there is a tiny sip there that you do when you're drinking liquids and when you're getting over a flu, and then there's a good healthy sip that you do when you're sipping whiskey. So that way you have enough in there to fully experience the mouthfeel, fully experience the taste, and fully experience the finish. To experience those things, you do need a certain amount of liquid in, and that's what we mean when we say always sip, never slam. And if all goes well, this will now be followed up with a sample of this guy's podcast with some visuals that we're going to add later. But so fuel your fandom, check it out, support Kevin, and see you next time with another episode of Nerds Drink Whiskey.
And now for a sample of the Fuel Your Fandom podcast. Since it's just an audio podcast, I'm going to show you my favorite Baby Yoda memes while you listen. Enjoy!
Today is a conversation that I've waited years and years and years to have, and I'm super, super excited to be here with him. We're going to talk about video games, and in specific video games, but more detailed into retro video gaming culture, things of that nature. And joining me today is a very, very good friend of mine who's been a friend of mine for more years than I can count. His name is Jim. I want to welcome you to the show, Jim.
Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I'm happy as a clam to be here.
Well, I'm happy as a clam that you are here. So this is one of the first episodes that we're recording remotely, myself being in the lovely state of Washington. And Jim, where you at?
I am in Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, so about as far away as you could possibly get and still be in the continental United
quite a
States.
hike.
But
it's practically Canada.
What I usually like to do with my guests before we sit down and get deep into it is I just kind of throw it to you and you kind of explain a little bit about what you're nerdy about. It doesn't have to be on topic. Just kind of what are you nerdy about? What's your passion? What's your fandom? And just kind of dig into your head a little bit. Do you mind?
Oh gosh, yeah, I'm 90% nerd. I don't really have a whole lot of hard drive space left for anything else. Movies, music. I've been a professional writer for the last 20 years, so I'm a complete nerd about English and love to dig into to grammar and just analyze words. But video gaming has been something that I have loved for a very, very long time. I mean, I'm quite old. First of all, I should establish that. I turn 45 next year, so essentially I picked a hobby that. I'm not going to say matured because that wouldn't be accurate, but grew up at least right alongside of me. The first
I'm 42.
console I can
right
remember.
there with you.
Yeah, the first console I can remember having wasn't even an Atari 2600. It was prior to that. This was one of those things that I don't remember the name of it. There were several things that had a similar form and function, but it was a Pong deck that actually had the fader style slider controls built right onto the console, and it was in black and white. So you hooked it up to your TV and you could move the paddles. Yeah, it might have been.
Odyssey. I think I have one.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a Magnavox Odyssey 2 at one point also. That was something else that came up a couple years later. But, and then I was enthralled as a kid because as a kid, you look at the TV and you see, the actors and actresses and people on TV, and you can't interact with them. You can yell at the TV, but they don't listen to you. So as a kid, I was enthralled by, you mean I can make something on the TV move? I move this thing, and the thing on the TV moves? It was just, it connected these synapses in my tiny developing brain that just really, that gratification of being able to affect what's happening on the screen in front of me has never really gone away. So, of course, it's an unwritten rule that kids have every toy their parents ever wanted, so my dad was super into Pac-Man. So we bought the Atari 2600 and, of course, the legendarily awful adaptation of Pac-Man that was on that console.
I remember.
And, it was terrible. Although as a kid, I loved it. I didn't know any better. I loved all of these supposedly terrible video game adaptations that were on I loved Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was supposed to be awful. I loved E.T., which was,
legendarily awful.
Credited with the crash of the industry. Yeah, all the landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. It wasn't about quality for me early on, at least. It was about the idea that I could, pick up this joystick or this controller or this whatever the interface was and make stuff move around on the TV. That seemed like magic to me. I'd never really gotten over it. So as I got older, I had an NES and an SNES and a Genesis, and I had friends that we would trade games back and forth. And of course, when you were in junior high, nobody was playing video games. They were playing Nintendo because it was the only game in town. And, I actually had some very important life decisions to make at one point. I went to college and needed a game console. So at the time, I was reading, I think it must have been Electronic Gaming Monthly or something, one of the old journals of the industry. And they talked about how the home versions of Mortal Kombat 2 or 3, I think. It was 3. Mortal Kombat 3 would have been like 93, 94. I made the decision to buy an SNES over a PlayStation because I remember reading, because I loved Mortal Kombat 3 in the arcades. I remember those. When there not only were malls, but also Aladdin's castles in those malls. Mm-hmm. I bought the SNES version because I remember reading in a magazine article, it is the most pixel-perfect adaptation of this game because they contrasted it against the PlayStation version. And even though I never played Shang Tsung as a character, they said if you play Shang Tsung on a disc-based system as opposed to a cartridge-based system, if you morph into another character, you have the game freezes for 5 or 6 seconds while it loads the data from the disc so that you can transform into the other character. And I thought, well, that's going to mess up the momentum. You don't want that. So I made the decision to buy the SNES instead. And it's been a lifetime of those kinds of decisions. And I also was lucky enough to grow up in a town, a resort town in southeastern Wisconsin called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And it had an arcade called Gameland that sadly is not there anymore. But it was one of those wonderful places that smelled like popcorn and cotton candy. And they bought a whole bunch of cabinets way back in the day, and they had an original Star Wars Vector cabinet. Mm-hmm. They had some pinball machines. They had an original Galaxian, an original Jungle Hunt.
That was just a short sample of the Fuel Your Fandom podcast. If you like what you heard, click the links in our show notes to subscribe.